Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, some big updates. What's going on with January 6th when it comes to the FBI looking for extremists? They've now labeled 3 different categories of groups that they said, you know, protested or entered the Capitol building on January 6th, who they're maybe going to be going after in some regards. The FBI is also identifying the kind of setting down the definition of what they call this domestic terror threat. I'll be going into what they actually mean by this, which groups they're referring to. Also, folks, there have been some new updates on election integrity. So, including some folks who've been arrested, some in fact, government officials who've been arrested. I'll be getting into this. Yeah, good seeing y'all here. Hey, Tony Gorza, good seeing you. Greetings from Georgia. Hey, Roseanne Dunn. Hi, Josh. Hi, Joshua Philipp from California. Good seeing y'all. It's all good. You said, y'all cracked me up. Yeah, good seeing y'all here. All right, folks. As always, if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. In the meantime, let's go over some stories. All right. Hey, real quick, Janine Graham Schenk, you said, hello from Jupiter, Florida. I've been through that area. I love Jupiter. Yeah, good to see y'all here. All right, folks. Let's jump into the first story for the night. Now, this is Epoch Times. It says here, FBI says biggest domestic terror threats in 2021 are violent extremists motivated by race or anti-authority views. Now, I assume by extremists motivated by race or anti-authoritarian views, they're probably referring to like Black Lives Matter or, Antifa, right? We can only assume, right? People who commit violence, violent extremism based on race or anti-authority views. I'm half joking. We'll have to see what they mean by this. Let's jump into this, right? It says here, the greatest domestic terror threats facing the United States in 2021 come from racially motivated or anti-government violent extremists. A senior FBI counterterrorism official told congressional committees looking into the January 6th Capitol breach on Wednesday. And I'm only actually half joking about Antifa, for example, maybe being targeted by the Biden administration. Let me go over this just brief, then we'll go deeper into it. As I mentioned, during any kind of large-scale social movement, they typically only maintain the elements of chaos for as long as chaos is needed within the system. Once they achieve power, typically the elements of chaos are no longer needed. This is why, for example, Mao Zedong, after he launched his revolution, took the Red Guard, who were actually a whole lot like Antifa, and sent them all to the countryside to become like peasant farmers. That was his strategy. Some different extremist groups take the ones they used for this and they execute them, like Che Guevara under Fidel Castro. Typically, the groups they used for the agitation phase, the chaos phase, are phased out once the organization trying to achieve power through these efforts actually get what they want. Because once they're in power, they no longer need instability. They no longer need those forces. And so it is possible, we'll have to see how this goes, but it is possible these groups may be targeted as well. But we'll have to see, given how deeply, again, the narratives have been formed. And very likely what they're referring to here is other groups they're defining along with this. Now, let's dig into what's being said here, and I'll show you another story right after this. It kind of goes into similar notes and kind of more clearly defines some of the categories they're discussing. Let's go into this. Let's go into this a bit more, though, first. Now, this official... this is Jill Sanborn, Assistant Director in charge of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI. She said this, quote, looking forward, the FBI assesses there is an elevated threat of violence from domestic violent extremists, and some of these actors have been emboldened in the aftermath of the breach of the U.S. Capitol. And continued, quote, and keep in mind, she's speaking to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs and the Committee on Rules and Administration. She continues, we expect racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists, and other domestic violent extremists citing partisan political grievances will very likely pose the greatest domestic terrorism threat in 2021 and likely into 2022. Now, a key word here, right? They're talking about racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. Anti-government, meaning you oppose whatever regime is in place, or whatever political parties in place, or anti-authority, violent extremists. Does this mean anarchists? Does this mean Antifa? Right? It's not really clear yet. And other domestic violent extremists citing partisan political grievances. And the important part is here, citing partisan political grievances. And it's this statement that really drives home the very likely point that they're not talking really about Antifa or talking about BLM. Very likely they're talking about some kind of category of Trump supporters, because citing partisan political grievances. And which partisan group, right? We're a bipartisan system for the most part, two-party system for the most part, although you do have libertarians who tend to be more conservative, Republican, and you do tend to have these socialists, anarchists who tend to be more on the Democrat side, right? Really, though, we're pretty much in a two-party system for the most part. And so when they talk about partisan political grievances, that means one or the other. And so they're saying that these violent extremists citing partisan political grievances will likely pose the greatest domestic terrorism threat in 2021 and likely in 2022. Now, it's not clear exactly why they end it at 2021 or 2022. Maybe they think that emotions will die down. Maybe they think the quote-unquote threat will die down. Not really clear right now. One thing we can say, though, is that so far some of their intelligence doesn't seem to be lining up. You might remember they were citing some Q thing, for example. It was supposed to happen today. They said on, March 4th, there was going to be the true inauguration or something like this. I'll be honest, it's sometimes hard to tell what's actually based on people actually reading whatever these posts were, or whether it's media just making things up and then partisan politics running with it and trying to drive narratives with it. I'll be going into this a bit more, but let's go into this a bit further, the story. Now, she added, again, this FBI official, she added that known driving forces of domestic violence extremism include, quote, racism, anti-Semitism, perceived government or law enforcement overreach, like BLM or defund the police, right? Perceived government or law enforcement overreach. Which party is trying to defund the police again? Remind me here, right? Socio-political conditions and personal grievances. This is actually interesting, right? Because socio-political conditions means like the social dimension. As politics goes into the social dimension, they're using basically plays on words here that in ways that could describe a lot of people, right? Perceived government or law enforcement overreach. If you perceive the government having overreach, the very basis of socialism is the state capitalist monopoly, meaning that the government itself is overreaching into the, private realm. Or fascism, ironically, which is kind of what the government has started practicing, which is the marrying of big government with big corporations. And if you look at which big corporations are aligning themselves with government, including for censorship, well, I think you don't have to look very hard right now, right? When they talk about, again, personal grievances, that's a pretty broad spectrum. And so they're really painting a pretty broad brush on individuals they're defining under this. Essentially, what they're saying is any person who is unhappy with the government currently in power or the way things are being done could be deemed essentially a domestic terrorist. That is really the length of the broad brush they're painting with. But of course, when they make statements like this, typically people's eyes, you learn this as a writer, typically people's eyes go to the beginning and the end of a statement, right? And their attention starts at the beginning and the end of a statement. And so the first thing they say will be the most hard-hitting, the biggest thing, the one that scares you the most, the one that ties it to something bad. And oftentimes they'll say that at the end as well. Here they're not doing that, though, fully, but they are starting with racism, anti-Semitism, most things that most people would condemn. I'd say even a lot of conservatives would condemn racism, for example, which, again, conservatives seem to be one of the targets here. Yeah, anyways, let's go deeper into this. Now, Sandburn's official warning came right after she said she didn't know of any firearms being recovered from the breach of the U.S. Capitol after reports of, quote, armed groups being involved. And really, that kind of blew a big hole, pun not intended, blew a big hole in the narrative being put out there that, people were planning a coup, that they came armed and so on. Again, there were reports of armed groups being involved. It's important to note some context on that. Now, the FBI assessed that there were no armed people there. There was no firearms recovered. from the breach of the U.S. Capitol building, meaning people who actually entered the building. None of them, at least that were searched and anything like that, there were no firearms found. There were 2 instances of people allegedly having firearms in their cars. One was just random Trump supporters, and I guess police searched their car somehow, found firearms. Yeah, people drive from all over the country. It's not too out of the ordinary. Again, they left it in the car. There was also an Antifa-tied group. Actually, I think NBC or one of the mainstream news outlets reported on this, although the Antifa tie wasn't mentioned till much further into the article. I believe they had a rifle and a crossbow in their car. Again, not quite being stated in the full context. But again, the important part here is that the narrative of people actually breaching the building being painted as armed groups by a lot of the media, and also being painted as individuals who tried launching essentially a coup. There's no evidence of that. Now, when asked by Senator Ron Johnson, a Republican from Wisconsin, about whether firearms were recovered or if any suspect was charged with firearm offenses, FBI counterterrorism chief Jill Sanborn responded, quote, "To my knowledge, none." An important point there. But in the hearing, Sanborn said that before the January 6th incident, quote, "We knew they would be armed." They knew they would be armed, but the people were not armed, right? How is this narrative working out? We knew they would be armed. We had intelligence they would be coming to D.C., which blows a hole in the whole narrative of them trying to impeach Trump, saying Trump incited it if they pre-planned it, right? We had intelligence they would be coming to D.C. And also raises the question of, well, look, Trump tried getting them to have the National Guard present at that building. If they had intelligence that armed individuals, as she's saying here, if armed individuals were coming to D.C., right, saying this, why did Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in charge of security at the Capitol building not allow for that security to be in place? She does clarify we did not have intelligence that they would be breaching the Capitol. Now, it seems that this "we knew they would be armed" is kind of empty, because in her own admission, they were not armed. And she said they would be coming to D.C. Obviously, you have people coming to D.C. If they believe these were armed individuals coming, why did they not have extra security, which they did not? And why did, for example, government officials in charge of security, ironically, some of the same government officials now themselves trying to launch the investigation into what happened, when they themselves should be part of or subjects of investigation, because they played a role in why security wasn't in place regardless of warnings. It's falling apart, let's put it that way. Now, the armed individuals related to January 6th appear to have been arrested by law enforcement outside the Capitol building. And again, this is the only ones I talked about, right? Including 33-year-old Christopher Alberts, who officers pushed back from the Capitol after suspecting he had a firearm in his possession, and they were right. Another armed individual arrived in D.C. on January 6th, a day after the breach, right? And threatened to kill a Speaker of the House. A third man, in other words, not tied to January 6th, it was after January 6th. A third man, retired veteran Lonnie Kaufman from Alabama, was arrested at his vehicle as he returned from the Capitol. Police found nearly a dozen Molotov cocktail explosive devices in his pickup truck, as well as a number of guns, ammunition, and concerning handwritten notes. All men faced firearm charges, among other charges. I'm curious how many people were arrested for having Molotov cocktail explosive devices during the riots that swept across the country, including, for example, the individual who firebombed the church across the street from the White House. And when Trump tried to visit the White House after that had happened, well, the media painted him as the bad guy, right? Now, let's go into another story with this, because these relate. It says here, this is a Epoch Times. FBI dividing pro-Trump ralliers involved in the Capitol breach into 3 different groups. And this is FBI Director Christopher Wray. This seems to be how they're now categorizing people based on what happened on January 6th. And this is, again, FBI Director Christopher Wray doing this, right? FBI Director stating this now. By the way, the drink tonight is kombucha, going for the classic. Crossroads classic, yeah. All right, it says here, FBI Director Christopher Wray said the agency is dividing pro-Trump ralliers and those who engaged in rioting during the Capitol breach into 3 different groups, while suggesting that the majority of the protesters in January 6th were peaceful. Well, it's at least nice they're saying that they were mostly peaceful protests. This narrative is being pulled out again, and they're not going after every single person there. Although some individuals, Candace Owens, for example, notes that she has friends who had FBI agents show up at their doors questioning them, or agents showing up at the doors questioning them when they didn't actually even enter the Capitol building. Let's go into this. Now, Wray, in a Senate hearing this week, again, FBI Director Christopher Wray, not just some random FBI agent, FBI director, in a Senate hearing this week, suggested that most of the rally goers on January 6th were peaceful. And he told lawmakers, quote, the first group, the largest group, right, the group we need to spend the least time talking about is peaceful, maybe rowdy protesters, but who weren't violating the law. The second group consists of individuals who might have come to the rally to peacefully protest, but got caught up in the events of the day. A second group, that is people who may have come intending to just be part of a peaceful protest, he said, quote, but either got swept up in the motive or emotion or whatever, engaged in kind of low-level criminal behavior. And Wray remarked, stating this as reported by the Washington Examiner's Brian York. Now, crimes of these individuals include trespassing on Capitol grounds, but not actually reaching the building and breaching it. And so this is interesting here because individuals within the second category here, right, as he describes it, a second group who may have come intending to be part of the peaceful protest, but got swept up in, what happened on emotion or whatever. He's stating these individuals may be charged with trespassing on Capitol grounds. So not charged, in other words, not actually breaching the building. And so individuals who are on Capitol grounds but didn't breach the building may be charged with this. And it's going to be difficult to figure out how this is, given that where do they put the fence, essentially? Where do they put the barrier on what defines Capitol grounds? Would it be the barriers they had established, of which Capitol Police were seen on video opening and waving people in? Is it going to be, for example, people who are further back from the Capitol building? It's not really clear what the full details are of this yet. Brandon Straka, for example, head of the walkaway movement, was one of the individuals charged. And Brandon Straka did not actually enter the Capitol building, it seems. One of the statements he made, allegedly, according to the charges he's facing, is that he encouraged someone to take a shield from a police officer. Unclear whether he was the one who encouraged the person to do it or just cheered them on as they did it. Right? The details of this are real slim right now. But you do have people who did not enter the Capitol building who are themselves being investigated and may be facing charges, as stated here, at least, of trespassing on Capitol grounds, but not actually reaching the building and breaching it. And that could be a lot of people. We'll have to see. Now, describing these individuals, second category again as, quote, opportunists, Wray noted that breaching the Capitol grounds is, quote, still criminal conduct. And so maybe a lot of people will face minor charges of, again, criminal trespassing on this. A bit further into this. Now he gets into the third group, and the third group are the ones it seems to be that they're really going after now. It says the third group is the smallest, he said, numerically. And they, quote, breached the Capitol grounds and engaged in violence against law enforcement who attempted to disrupt the members of Congress and the conduct of their constitutional responsibilities. And he said, quote, some of those people clearly came to Washington, we now know, with plans and intentions to engage in the worst kind of violence we would consider domestic terrorism. That's a pretty serious charge, right? Domestic terrorism. And so some of that coordination appears to have been coordinated travel, coordinated meeting up, coordinated in terms of what kind of gear they might be wearing or bringing with them, that kind of thing. Now, this is how they're defining This is how they are defining coordination, right? Coordinated travel. How many people traveled to the event with a group of friends? How many people traveled alone versus traveling in, a carpool of a group of friends? A lot of people went with their friends. Very few people, I'd say, went by them. Well, some did, of course, but a lot of people traveled with friends or family. Meaning a whole lot of people. Coordination, if they're defining coordination as coordinated travel. Coordinated meeting up. Now, the details on this are important. What is coordinated meeting up? Does that mean you plan to meet your friend at the Capitol building for the protest? You were at the earlier protest, again, hearing Trump speak, and you said, hey, I'll meet you there. Is that the details of it? Or is it, deeper coordination, right? And he said coordination in terms of what kind of gear they might be wearing or bringing with them, that kind of thing. And how many people, again, show up with gas masks? How many people show up prepared for what may be a large-scale protest if they're joining what is expected to be a large-scale protest? What kind of gear are they defining on this in terms of designating people as domestic terrorists, right? Again, consider domestic terrorists. We would consider domestic terrorists. It's possible that what he's specifically defining here, because the full context is important. Some of those, again, we'll go over this. Some of those people clearly came to Washington, we now know, with plans and intentions to engage in the worst kind of violence we would consider domestic terrorism. And some of that coordination, right, appears to have been coordinated travel, blah, blah, blah. And so it is based on the context. It seems to be that he's referring specifically, right, to people who carried out violence and had some degree of coordination. And based on this, the definition of coordination here is broad enough that pretty much anyone who engaged in violence could fall within those categories, right? Engage in the worst kind of violence, as he says, again, disrupting Congress, basically. And if you traveled with a friend, if you met someone up there, or if you wore gear that may suggest you planned on there being a protest, that may be enough to incriminate someone. Yeah, so real quick, Checkers X, you note that accused Capitol rioter John Sullivan sold video footage he recorded at the January 6th siege to NBC and CNN for $35,000 each. And John Sullivan, again, individual who was part of a Black Lives Matter affiliate and who, by his own admission, was tied to Antifa, was one of the individuals at the front lines of the protest inside the Capitol building, was broadcasting right next to Ashley Babbitt as she was allegedly shot, and as well went and sold the footage afterwards to CNN and was it NBC, I believe. And so we'll have to see what happens with him. There were other individuals there who were tied to Antifa. Sullivan himself, in his admission, claims he is not a member of Antifa, but he is affiliated with it by his own admission. And again, did have details of his chats, for example, on different websites, Discord, for example, talking about coordination and intentions of doing what he did. Now, it's unclear who is going to be charged with this. They have arrested several people tied, for example, Oath Keepers, which is a militia in the U.S., mainly of former law enforcement or military folks. And again, Oath Keepers, meaning they swore an oath to protect the Constitution. They are keeping that oath. That's what is suggested by that. Unclear, again, what is actually going to be happening with this, though. Now, again, the FBI director did not provide any specific numbers, but he said about 300 people so far have been arrested in connection to the breach, and not suggesting that those 300 people are going to be charged with the more serious end of this. But again, they are going in on this, right? And real quick, again, Jill Sanborn, who we just mentioned, an FBI counterterrorism official, one of the top ones, told senators on Wednesday again that she did not have any knowledge of suspects who were arrested in connection to the January 6th incident having any firearms, as no firearms were recovered by law enforcement officials, which really calls into question the nature, again, of how they're using domestic terrorism rather than, for example, mob violence or violent protests, engaging in violent protest. Domestic terrorism here is a pretty strong charge for people who don't have guns, don't have weapons that could actually cause major bodily harm. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what comes out from this. And on the note too, the Capitol police officer who died, and who, again, the media originally claimed, including many of the big mainstream news outlets, claimed was beaten to death by Trump supporters with, I believe, a fire extinguisher, and the story turned out to be untrue. He texted his brother that day, seeming in very good health, didn't have any issues. He only complained about breathing in smoke, died. The government is refusing to release his autopsy. They're refusing to release details on his death, meaning that while they refuse to release that, the full scope of that narrative, the full context of that narrative will not be provided to the public. And so, funky stuff going on, right? Now, let me go into a couple more parts on this because I want to finish up a few parts with this, and then I'll go into some questions. This is Gateway Pundit now. It says here, fake news ABC desperately tries to drum up controversy after 4 Trump supporters show up to the planned March 4th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Now, keep in mind, right, that they're trying to say that until 2021 or 2022, there's this risk of domestic terrorist extremism. And you had all this drumming up among the mainstream media, among politicians, saying that, the Capitol was going to be under siege today on March 4th. And that, the QAnon conspiracies were talking about the true inauguration on March 4th. There was going to be, potential violence and stuff. 4 people show up. And of course, the media tries to paint those 4 people as, being part of this whole conspiracy. Now let's go into this just a little bit, and I'll jump into some other stuff. Now it says, this is Gateway Pundit, again, a little more opinionated. They say the fake news media is at it again. ABC News desperately tried to drum up some drama after virtually no one showed up to the U.S. Capitol on Thursday. Earlier this week, Capitol Police increased security, right? Increased security based on suspicious intel, right? Warning of a militia plot to breach the Capitol on March 4th. Thousands of National Guard troops are currently protecting the Capitol. They surrounded the fence and razor wire, but it's not enough, they said. The Capitol Police claiming there was intel warning of a new plan to attack the building, right? According to Fox 5 DC, quote-unquote, sources said they received an intelligence bulletin warning that 3%ers, 3%ers being another militia in the U.S., they claim that I think it's 3% of Americans fought in the American Revolution, and they believe that they would fight for to protect the country. Again, a militia. That 3%ers were planning on breaching the Capitol on Thursday, March 4th, and March 4th is the original day on which the U.S. inaugurated president. So QAnon followers, it claims, believe Trump will be in D.C. this Thursday to be sworn in on the 4th, according to Fox 5 D.C. Right, that's how it was framed. And who showed up? 4 peaceful Trump supporters showed up at the U.S. Capitol on Thursday, and ABC News made it out to again, it was a big issue, right? And this is how they framed it. This is ABC News, a tweet here, right? They said, high security at U.S. Capitol as Trump supporters gather, hoping for his return to power. 4 Trump supporters show up. And they show, military troops, again, National Guard troops, walking with their rifles. It looks very scary and so on. And here's what's really going on at the U.S. Capitol. Well, really nothing. There's a video down here you can watch. So, folks, this is what you often have with media. You have them frame things. Politicians react to the media articles. Media, again, react to the politicians. This is how they advance narratives. This is how they keep narratives alive. It's how even false narratives, even if they're proven false, in this case, for example, even if proven false, can be kept alive within the public conscious in public discussion, even if there's no evidence to support it, like no firearms being involved, like them trying to impeach Trump, saying Trump incited the riots, while at the same time FBI is trying to say there's pre-planning. Like, for example, them saying that they had intelligence that there was going to be, an armed, protest and so on, while government people in charge of security, meaning maybe Pelosi and so on, chose not to accept Trump's offer to actually offer additional security, including, for example, the National Guard. All these important points within the true narrative are left out because that is not what matters. What matters is convincing the people that there's a huge public threat of radicalized Trump supporters who pose a threat to the government itself. And they're using this to, again, drum up fear, drum up, I'd say, division in this country, drum up conspiracies that anybody who questions what happened during the elections is somehow an extremist and, you want to overthrow the government or something like that. That is the narrative being used. And it's a hollow narrative, frankly. It's a hollow narrative, and it's one that, again, is only being maintained through this, again, echo chamber between government officials repeatedly making statements, media repeatedly reporting on those statements, and then government officials responding to the reporting on those statements to make it appear something's actually happening, right? It's a self-feeding system, one that is based on nothing, that has no foundation to it, no real foundation to it, I should say. And one last part on this, because this is important. I'll just mention this briefly. Pelosi is saying, National Guard to stay at Capitol, quote, as long as they are needed. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, of course, said thousands of National Guard troops deployed at the U.S. Capitol may remain, quote, as long as they are needed, following a report that said the Capitol Police requested the Guard to stay in place for 2 more months. And she said, we have to have what we need when we need it, and then if the numbers that we and in the numbers that we need. And she said that's a security decision and not hers. She said this issue of the National Guard is one that will be made by the Capitol Police and the Police Board and the rest. But I'm not in a position to respond to that question. But we should have them here as long as they are needed. Now, are they needed? Or is it media and political statement and politicians responding to those articles, keeping the perceived need for that in place, right? Now, they're behaving very strangely. But let's go into a few questions, folks, and then we'll go into some more stories because I have some interesting stuff about election integrity, let's call it. I think you'll find it very interesting, including some new arrests, including actually the do-over of one of the elections in the U.S. as well, based on some new findings. I'll go into this. In the meantime, let's go into a few questions, then we'll jump into that a bit more. This is from, let's see here, this is from Monica Morris. They said, Josh, with the socialist situation, do you think they would censor what we see on the 1-6 hearings? Already, they've done a purge, for example, of Trump's speech. They even did it, for example, on CPAC, where any media that even posted the video of Trump speaking got a strike. And if you get 3 strikes, you're kicked off YouTube. I'll be going into this if we have time. Actually, that you've had media getting strikes. One of them actually got kicked off. I believe it was Right Side Broadcasting, I want to say. They're going after people, even reporting on it. In other words, even reporting on Trump's statements at this point, even airing a video of Trump speaking at this point will get you censored. That is where things are at with this. Will they censor what happened? Here's the reality: is that who controls the past controls the future. Isn't that what George Orwell said? Right? He who controls the past controls the future. And as people continue rewriting the past, there's no actual truth. Truth is what you make of it. They can claim whatever they want happened and essentially make that the record of history. And if they can alter the record of history, they can form the narrative going forward. The perceived history, once you're here and not where we are right now, becomes whatever is written. Yeah, right. So real quick, God is Awesome is noting RSBN. Yeah, they were kicked off YouTube for posting the video of Trump's speech at CPAC. That was what they did, right? Posted the video of Trump speaking. They were kicked off YouTube. But again, whoever controls essentially the record of history is the one that determines what people remember. Because 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, when kids who weren't there during that time, right? When kids are, for example, being educated in college, or journalists are trying to do research and they're going back and researching what happened, what happens if the only historical records are false records? And what happens if they try to actually find the original videos and they find that there's no historical record of it? The only sources then become the false reports. And the false reports then become the record of history. And this is what they do. This is what communist regimes have done throughout history. That's the last 100 years. This is what, for example, George Orwell warned about when he talked about INGSOC, English socialism, and what it would lead to. All right? It's exactly what all these folks say. Ryszard Legutko, who is an official in Poland, and who wrote a book called, what was it? He wrote a book called The Demon in Democracy. He described communism as a war against memory, right? And individuals are, you really have to try to not forget the true history that took place, the real history that took place, as the records of history are being altered. And as, for example, in situations right now where even stating the true record of history will get you censored. Even posting, not even commenting on, even posting a historical record at this point can get you censored. And if they have absolute control over the platforms, over the institutions that allow you to actually even show this stuff, then where can you possibly find historical records to actually find out what actually happened? Well, unless you have it somewhere saved that's not connected to these platforms, ironically, through this marrying of government with corporations, which ironically is actually the real definition of fascism. Like, not the name calling version, but the actual definition, right? The marrying of the big corporate systems with government, right? Outside of that dichotomy, you have to have independent voices who maintain it. And that's the only way you can have historical record. On that note, you can still find it on the Epoch Times website. Anyone interested in watching Trump's speech at CPAC, it is still there. But yes, they are trying to erase this. And once that history is erased, then what does history become? History becomes anything people say it is. Anything that the remaining voices claim that history was becomes the memory of history. And anything else is called conspiracy or radical, dogma or, radical conspiracies or something like that, right? Truth becomes conspiracy once that happens. This is from Patrick Hardy. He said, how is it that Maxine Waters, Katie Griffith, and Madonna can get away with threatening the life of a standing president? Is that not extreme enough for them? Why are they not arrested and convicted? Why? And just a bit of context on this, Maxine Waters had made statements, for example, saying something like, if you see them on the streets, go out there and show them they're not well. You get a group together, you get a crowd together, and you show them you're not welcome, right? You coordinate a crowd to disrupt the president. Isn't that within the boundaries now of domestic terrorism as they're defining it? If you coordinate a crowd and get them to disrupt, government action, if they're anti-government forces, isn't this now within the boundaries of what they're defining as domestic terrorism? It would actually be fun to go back and basically use their own definitions to categorize their own actions and statements they made over the past 4 years, ironically pretty much doing everything that now they categorize as extremism and demonstrating that they themselves had committed that, right? Maxine Waters did that. Kathy Griffin, again, did the video of her pretending to hold the severed head of Trump, which Barron Trump apparently saw and freaked out because he thought it was real, and it was apparently some big thing. And Madonna stating that she would like to blow up the White House, allegedly. And so, yeah, these individuals said this stuff. Ironically, you even had most of the mainstream media going back to like 2016, even questioning, for example, the integrity and doing whole documentaries on loopholes within the election system, including with the voting machines. And they're not, getting multi-billion-dollar lawsuits or something like that. There's a real double standard with this stuff. And again, right? One of the reasons with this is who controls the record of history, who can criticize them for what they did and not be called, for example, a far-right voice or, whatever name they want to use against people at this point. Basically, again, if you forget history, forget what actually happened, the present becomes whatever they say it is, right? And the present does not recognize, and a lot of these mainstream news outlets and public voices does not recognize what they previously said, because again, it's the dialectic, it's the moving forward of the agenda, it's the progressive movement towards the goal they want to achieve, right? That's what it is. This is from Julie Ann. Julie Ann, you said, Josh, everyone asks, what can we do? Is it not our responsibility to contact our state legislatures and tell them to fight back on HR 1 and keep their rights to make our election laws? And on that note too, HR 1 is this big omnibus bill basically setting into stone from the level of the federal government election regulations that pretty much take everything that was controversial about the 2020 elections and make it federal law, meaning that all the governors who bypass the state legislatures to put into place, for example, global mail-in voting, things like this, that will be federal law if HR 1 is able to pass. It did pass the House of Representatives, has to go to the Senate now. Based on discussing with people, it's not quite clear. We'll have to see whether it can get through or not. But they're going to try. They're certainly going to try. People do ask what you can do with this. And there's a lot you can do. You can, of course, as you mentioned here, contact your state legislature, tell them you don't support it, and call on them to take action to challenge it. You can call on, for example, your local attorney general. And actually, I believe 20 attorney generals across the US right now are standing up to criticize this. And so you do have a lot of action around this. You do have things moving on this. There is, I believe that one at least. There's quite a few controversial bills right now. Yeah, there is a lot you can do about it. And again, as well, get ready, folks, because I really do think there's a grassroots movement ready to start in this country. And that was one of the biggest takeaways I had from CPAC, again, the Conservative Summit, CPAC, where I was, again, invited to speak on a panel on China. You can watch the video on Crossroads. And also did a lot of interviews with people there. Everybody's talking about grassroots organizing. It seemed almost every person I talked to was planning some kind of grassroots movement, whether it be educational or voting drives or getting people registered to vote. There's a lot of momentum right now. And Trump, again, has come out announcing his office of the former president, dedicated to community organizing, grassroots, and placing candidates who he's going to push to, again, overturn the House and Senate. There's a lot of momentum around this. And so those of you, really, of course, if you go to Democrat conferences, they oftentimes do have things to get involved with. In fact, a lot of times if you're talking to Democrats and you ask them, what can I do? They'll say, get involved, get active, get on the street. You talk to a lot of Republicans, you say, what can I do? They say, well, donate to the GOP and, support our president or something like that. The Republicans are now kind of meeting where the Democrats have often been, community organizing, things they typically don't get engaged in. And also Trump has announced his own PAC, the donaldjtrump.com, which is, interestingly, as I mentioned previously, going to very likely be the PAC that people donate to instead of the GOP, meaning that Trump is going to be leading this movement, it seems. This does seem to be the trajectory, right? All right, let's see here. This is from... Actually, let me go over just one more question. We'll go into some more stories. This is from Jay Buckley. He said, are you still convinced that the CCP will collapse within a year? It seems that the Democrats are trying to do that to our republic within a couple of months. Well, okay, so during the virus outbreak and when Trump was hitting them hard, I mentioned, I think within a year, the Chinese Communist Party would probably collapse. I do believe that had Trump stayed in office, it would have collapsed within a year. We'll have to see what Biden does with the sanctions and so on. To be honest, at this point, it seems they're going to revitalize it. Regardless of whether Biden repeals the sanctions on the CCP, regardless of whether he criticizes them, regardless of what happens, unless he continues to sanction them, unless he continues to hit them, unless he continues to call them out, they're going to be advancing their own agenda. And the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party right now is to build up their own digital currency, one, to replace the US currency, and by doing that, if they can establish this as a global currency, US sanctions don't matter anymore. Because the US sanctions are only able to affect China and other countries, which, again, China tends to work with after their sanction, like North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, so on, Iran. It kind of has its own international order outside of what can be sanctioned by the US. Countries, once they're sanctioned by the US, kind of have to fall in line with China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, countries within that real totalitarian spectrum typically, right? Or countries that have engaged in some kind of abuse have to pretty much engage in that, because once they're cut off from the US dollar, that's their only option. Once the Chinese Communist Party launches this new digital currency, which they have in China, and they're already testing it in several major cities, once they make it a global thing, US sanctions no longer have any power. That is the end. That is the end of sanctions being able to have significant impact. And if other countries jump in with the CCP on that, and the CCP has already advanced many, many parts of this, like their own reserve bank, their own systems to replace the US on pretty much the entire financial aspect, sanctions stop working. And once that happens, the US, it gets complicated basically, but once the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency, if it gets to that stage, if China can hit it at that level, if there's inflation because of it on that level, I know a lot of people are saying there's not going to be inflation. That's only on the assessment of these massive multi-trillion-dollar spending bills Democrats are pushing through, like, for example, the $1.9 trillion bailout package they're launching in addition to the previous over $1 trillion bailout package, which sent most of the money to other countries and so on. That's what they're saying is not going to cause inflation. If the CCP creates a global currency that replaces the US dollar or that can replace the US dollar as a reserve currency, and if many countries start adopting that, you're going to see the US dollar take a huge hit. And once that happens, really the US is going to have to default on a lot of these loans and so on. It's going to hit hard if that happens. And so what I'm saying here, answering your question, is the trajectory Trump was on, the CCP probably would have collapsed within a year. The current trajectory of things, unless Biden, even if he maintains the sanctions Trump put into place, the trajectory the CCP is using to bypass that, if he doesn't stop that, that's the game. And they're well on their way to doing so. Now, you still have the issue of internal instability in China. Actually, Epoch Times has had a lot of leaked documents from within the CCP we've been publishing that do show that the internal infighting within the Chinese Communist Party at the top levels is actually very tense right now. And so there's also the wild card that the CCP could just kind of tear itself apart from the inside right now. We'll have to see. There are a lot of factors to consider. Internal instability among the Chinese people being unhappy with the CCP as it is becoming more totalitarian. That is a huge factor. International pressure against the Chinese Communist Party. Germany, for example, doing sail-throughs with military vessels through the South China Sea. In other words, no longer depending on the U.S. to be the one force contesting the CCP. That's happening, meaning that the U.S. may be losing its international image a little bit. Something that Trump actually helped do because he backed off funding with NATO and so on, encouraging these other countries to start playing a role with funding their own militaries and revitalizing their own defense budgets and playing their own part, meaning that he's empowered other countries to start having their own militaries and standing up for themselves instead of depending on the U.S. to basically finance and bankroll their entire military operations. On a quick side note, one of the funny things attributed to the fact that most countries can even have real far-left socialist policies, including, for example, Medicaid, the free healthcare programs in Canada and different parts of Europe, mainly is because these countries have to pay like almost nothing in terms of defense because they depend on the United States for pretty much their entire defense budgets. And so the U.S. is, bankrolling essentially socialist policies in a lot of these countries by either giving them money or providing basic things that they should be using their money on, like defense, instead of, for example, playing their own roles. Trump did pull some of that back. So Germany doing freedom of navigation operations, Japan, India, Australia, other countries standing up. And so you are seeing this shift. Things are changing a bit. From Edmund Halsey, he said, Yanya Kellick, another great reporter at Epoch Times, senior editor, said American thought leaders, Epoch Times also had some of the best coverage. On that note, those of you who want to see some of the interviews we did at CPAC, I highly recommend some of them. Check out some we've been publishing. Really, I think you'll find that in the U.S., there is a lot of momentum. There is a very strong brewing grassroots in this country, and people are really coming together. It's very interesting to watch, and you have a lot of very, very smart people who don't get a lot of media coverage by the mainstream media, really, and who don't have much of a platform because of tech censorship, who actually are very smart people, and you pretty much only see them on the event circuits because they don't have a platform, pretty much. Check out some of them. We had some great interviews. All right, let's jump into a few more stories now. Now, a lot of you ask what's happening with the investigations into what happened in the 2020 elections. Well, there's some updates on this. It says here, judge orders new election after 78% of mail-in ballots found invalid. Notary arrested. They arrested the notary because of this. All right, let's go into this. A Mississippi judge ordered a new runoff election for the local election in Aberdeen. This is a local election, just to be clear. A Mississippi judge ordered a new runoff election for a local election in Aberdeen after more than 3 quarters More than 75% of absentee ballots cast in the June Democratic runoff election were found to be invalid, while the notary involved in the election was arrested. They actually arrested the guy, right? But again, don't question the integrity of the election system. It's actually flawless, as we know. No issue whatsoever. It was the most secure election ever held, and no need to question any of it, right? None of this is worth looking at. Right? It says here, Judge Jeff Wheel, in a 64-page order, said that there is evidence of fraud and criminal activity in how absentee ballots were handled, how they were counted, and actions from individuals at polling places during the runoff elections held in Aberdeen, Mississippi. As a result, the runoff election for the Ward 1 alderman seat is necessary, reported WCBI. Local election, but some of the same issues and allegations we saw in many other elections across the U.S. Some of the same issues. Now, the judge ruled that 66 of 84 absentee ballots that were cast in the election, or around 78%, should have never been counted, according to WCBI. Nicholas Holliday was declared the winner of the alderman seat by 37 votes, while challenger Robert Duvall contested the results in court, contested them, and won. Now, according to the judge, quote, the court is of the opinion there is probable cause that several individuals involved in the disturbances during election day at the polling precinct, quote, willfully and corruptly violated one or more of the above criminal statutes. You hear that? The court is of the opinion that there is probable cause, meaning that there's different. Is my mic messed up, folks? And how's the mic now? Any better? So if you're questioning, mic any better? All right, sorry. Now again, going into this, the court is of the opinion there's probable cause, right? Probable cause there is that several individuals involved in the disturbances during the election day at the polling precinct willingly and corruptly violated. Doesn't necessarily say that there was collaboration or coordination with them. Oh, good, it's working now. Sorry about that, folks. Thanks for letting me know. That they willfully and corruptly violated one or more of the criminal statutes. It said the court will leave to the appropriate authorities to determine whether the actions of these individuals amounted to, quote, prosecutable crimes. And one of the big things to be seen is, were these people involved in other elections? Were similar practices observed in other elections? What actually happened? Was this, for example, just one election that was like this? The same problem took place? Or were others? At the very least, we see this starting to be investigated. And on this note, too, let's go into another one. Here's something I think you'll all find quite interesting again. 2 New Jersey city councilmen indicted on mail-in voting fraud charges. Now, the real quick, the irony with a lot of this, mail-in voting, problems with signatures, as we've seen in other states, problems with, for example, the notarized votes, so on. All these things, we're seeing all these issues. These are the same types of systems that you normally have, right? For example, normally you have systems in place, safeguards in place to prevent things like this from happening. Normally you have systems in place to prevent this from happening. What is happening now, though, is that those safeguards, the things to make sure problems like this don't happen, have been pulled out. They've been removed. And what does this mean for going forward as well? This was, again, done by many local governments. Local governments removed the safeguards and then, again, led to problems like we're seeing here. Now they're trying to make it so that the federal government, through, this H.R. 1, I believe it is, making it so the federal government mandates these same types of laws, removal of safeguards, across the entire United States. And issues like this are what we're seeing come up here. Getting into this. It says 2 New Jersey city councilmen indicted on mail-in voting fraud charges. It says 2 city council members in Paterson, New Jersey were indicted on mail-in voting fraud charges related to the city's May 2020 election, officials said on March 3rd. Michael Jackson, 49, and Alex Mendez, 45, face a variety of charges, including election fraud, fraud in casting mail-in votes, tampering with public records, and unauthorized possession of ballots, according to a statement from the New Jersey Attorney General's office. They were initially charged in June 2020 after winning their races for city council seats. Meaning, again, right? These were both city council members who were arrested, again, right, for what they did. I would sort of the charges. Who were arrested, won their seats, but found to have won their seats against the law, basically. Innocent until proven guilty, of course, but pretty serious again. And a lot of the same problems and allegations we were seeing in many other elections across the United States. The real interesting thing to see here, though, is that the individuals who have been arrested, right, are the officials who used these systems to achieve that. And yeah, you folks are right. This is fraud, election fraud. I don't know, is my mic still messed up? It's terrible. Sorry for the mic, folks. I'll have to check out my mic. Yeah. All right, let's see here. Yeah. And as I mentioned briefly, 20 Republican attorney generals are pointing to constitutional deficiencies in the Democrats' election overhaul bill. Again, that H.R. 1. I mentioned this briefly before. 20 Republican attorney generals. Now, they signed a letter on March 3rd calling on the leaders of the U.S. House and Senate to consider a number of constitutional flaws in the major election overhaul bill currently being pushed by Democrats. Again, this passed the House, now going to be voted on by the Senate. And this is the one pretty much institutionalizing at the federal level all the changes they made to our election systems, right? All the things they changed in our election systems in 2020. And letter sent by Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita points to several potential legal flaws in the For the People Act of 2021, a top legislative priority for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat again. And the signatories warned that they would take legal action if the bill becomes law. The bill was passed in the House late on March 3rd by a razor-thin margin. And here's why this matters, folks. 20 attorney generals across the United States say that if this does pass, meaning even if it does pass, they're going to be challenging this in these different states. 20 of them signed a letter stating that they will do so, meaning that if Democrats don't, for example, amend the constitutional flaws that they're noting within H.R. 1, that you're going to see a legal battle take place afterwards to ensure these things do not actually affect the elections going forward. And a lot of you folks have noted, questioning, what's going to happen, 2022, where Trump is talking about overturning the House and the Senate, trying to do that. If they, for example, are institutionalizing a lot of laws that raise concerns about the integrity of election systems. Well, here you have it. Even if they do this, what you're going to see is 20 Republican attorney generals at least taking legal action to push back against this. All right, folks, let's go into a few other questions real quick. Let's see here. This is from John John Papagni, I'm sorry. He said, Joshua, have you heard about the news reporters have to pay to be tested to be at Biden's conference? Yes, I have. And in fact, we actually have at Epoch Times a White House reporter. We do have White House credentials, not part of the press pool because the press pool is kind of managed by the mainstream media and organizations tied to it. Yes, that is the case. The Biden administration set up basically a testing facility, but reporters have to pay to be tested. And it's over $100 every time they want to get tested. I can't remember the full amount. Let's see here. Beth Denerso Snell, said, did you hear that Trump's appointee, Federico Klein, was arrested in connection with the Capitol riots? I did hear this, and I believe they're going to probably try to arrest a whole bunch of others as well. I think they're going to really try to go after government officials as being the ones accused, for example, of having been involved in the planning. This is from American Patriot. You said, not the mic. Not your mic. Oh, thank you for pointing it out. So it's not my mic. I'll still try to figure out what happened. A lot of you are mentioning that my mic is having a robotic sound. It's very strange. I'm not sure what it could be. You say now the video is fuzzy. On my end, it looks normal. I wonder what's happening. On my end, it all looks normal. Internet looks like it's fine. I don't know. We'll troubleshoot it, folks. I'm really sorry about the sound issues today. And let's see here. I'll make it this last one because it seems we're having some issues and it's getting late anyways. All right, this is from Digia Wheatgrass. You said, "Hi, Josh. Is it true that Trump has secret presidential powers currently in place?" You say it's PEDS, Presidential Emergency Action Documents. I have not heard this. We do know that Trump did declare a state of emergency. We know, for example, he put into place the National Guard as well during the time, again, after the Capitol protests. And so he did declare national emergency. There were other things in place. I personally have not heard about him having power still in any way. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can look into it. But as far as I know, I don't think Trump has presidential powers currently. All right, folks. Yeah, apologize for the problems. We'll troubleshoot it, figure out what happened. In the meantime, folks, as always, again, I'm doing these live Q&As Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So tune in again this Sunday. Be back again. And that said, folks, is also please check out some of the interviews we've been doing. I think you'll like a lot of them. Really in-depth conversations, really interesting things happening in this country right now that a lot of media aren't talking about, and really some great folks we've been talking to. Now, that said, folks, as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. Americans gradually losing faith in the different institutions this country is built upon, including now the electoral system, and including now as well the systems of justice. Now, America, on both sides, people are concerned about the integrity of our country, the integrity of the systems this country is built upon. And going forward, this country needs more than ever to find a way to reconcile with this corruption as they observe it, whether you're Democrat or Republican, observing politicians they believe do not represent them, observing justice systems they believe have not acted in accordance with the grievances they brought to them. The country right now is in a state of disarray and a state of hopelessness. And moving forward, I think more than ever, people need a ray of hope. People need to realize and understand once again, and see proof of it, that the system represents their interests, that the representatives we have in these offices represent the American people and not personal interest, that the systems of elections represent the will of the people and not the will of a handful of individuals who may not be willing to hear information or be willing to look at information. The United States is in a very desperate state right now. And for the world as well, this goes even deeper, because America was the beacon of hope. America was the model of a free society. America was the system on which the image of a free and open society was built. And many countries look to the United States as a model for their own countries, their own model for what a free and self-governing people look like. That model is now being damaged. That image is now being damaged. And countries are now wondering what model to look at. As we go forward, the Chinese Communist Party very likely will use this. The Chinese Communist Party will very likely try to rebuild itself. And the CCP's China model, as they call it, will become a competitor to the U.S. model on the global stage. This is where the United States and the world are now at.